What if the person you trust most is the one who betrays you? In June 1978, a plumber named Mehmet Yilmaz walked into the Iraqi embassy in Paris, carrying a toolbox filled with microphones. He'd been doing this twice a month for 3 years. The receptionist smiled at him. The security guard waved him through without opening the box. By the time he left that afternoon, 17 listening devices were hidden in the building's walls. No one suspected him. No one would until the day someone finally did. This man wasn't a plumber. His real name was Jacob Lev, and he was a Mossad signals intelligence officer who'd been living in Paris under a false identity since 1975. Jacob didn't just pretend to be Mehmet for a mission. He became Mehmet so completely that when the deception finally collapsed, he couldn't prove who he really was. This is the story of an operation that succeeded because it was perfect and failed for the exact same reason. Jacob Lev wasn't supposed to be a field agent. He was a technician from Tel Aviv who spoke fluent Turkish and adequate French. In 1974, Mossad offered him a job that sounded simple: live in Paris for 5 years as someone else. Not undercover for a week, not a quick insertion and extraction. 5 years as a completely different person. They built Mehmet Yilmaz from scratch, Turkish immigrant who arrived in France in 1970, licensed plumber, tax records dating back 4 years, a small apartment in the 18th arrondissement, utility bills, a girlfriend named Aishi who worked at a bakery and didn't know she was also Mossad. The backstory had to survive real scrutiny because Turkish workers in Paris were already being watched. French intelligence monitored them for Kurdish separatist connections. Turkish intelligence tracked potential dissidents. The Soviets recruited them as low-level informants. Mehmet couldn't just seem real, he had to be real enough that when someone checked, everything confirmed itself. Jacob arrived in Paris in March 1975. For the first 8 months, he worked as an actual plumber. No spying, no intelligence gathering, no contact with handlers except dead drops every 6 weeks where he left reports about nothing important, which toilets he'd fixed, which customers complained, how much he'd earned. He ate alone at cheap restaurants. He sent money to a fictional mother in Ankara through a real bank account Mossad controlled. He attended a mosque in the 19th arrondissement irregularly, not devout enough to stand out, but present enough to be noticed. This wasn't training. This was the operation. Because the target wasn't a building or a document. It was the moment when people would stop seeing him as a potential threat and start seeing him as furniture. In November 1975, a French plumbing company called Bellinger at Fils submitted a bid for routine maintenance at the Iraqi embassy, twice monthly service calls. Standard repairs. The contract went through normal channels because Mossad had spent 18 months positioning Bellinger as the preferred contractor for diplomatic buildings in the 7th arrondissement. Mehmet Yilmaz became their embassy specialist, not because he was the most skilled, because he was Muslim, spoke broken Arabic, and seemed grateful for steady work. The embassy security officer was named Tariq al-Mashadani. He interviewed Mehmet for 15 minutes, asked about his mosque, his family back home, whether he sent money to Turkey. Jacob answered every question correctly because he'd actually lived those answers for 8 months. He didn't recite a legend. He described his life. Tariq didn't just believe him. He felt sorry for him. A man far from home, working hard, sending money to his mother. Tariq saw someone harmless, someone beneath suspicion. That pity became Jacob's greatest weapon and eventually his greatest vulnerability. The first listening device went into a third-floor bathroom in January 1976. Jacob installed it during a routine toilet repair, 11 minutes. The device was disguised as a standard pipe coupling metal, threaded, identical to French plumbing specifications except for the transmitter hidden in the core. It worked for 6 weeks before the battery died. By then, Jacob had placed 3 more. The rhythm was simple: arrive, repair something real, plant one device, leave. Never more than one per visit. Never in the same area twice in a row. The Iraqi security protocol was equally simple. Check the toolbox going in. Watch the plumber if he's near sensitive rooms. Check the toolbox coming out. No one ever checked the pipes. By mid-1977, Mossad's Paris station was receiving audio from 12 locations inside the embassy. Conversations between Baghdad and the ambassador. Arguments about Soviet weapons deals. Personnel gossip. But Jacob was developing a problem no one had anticipated. He was getting too good at being Mehmet. His French improved beyond what a Turkish laborer should speak. He solved a complex valve problem the embassy's regular contractor couldn't fix. Tariq praised him but also started asking new questions. Where exactly did Mehmet learn German engineering standards? Why did his hands not look like a plumber's hands? Jakob deflected, said his father worked in a German factory, taught him as a boy. It was plausible. Tariq accepted it. But it created a new detail Jakob had to remember, a new branch of the backstory he'd have to maintain for the next 3 years. The better he performed as Mehmet, the more questions people asked. The more questions he answered, the deeper the deception grew. And somewhere in Paris, someone was already watching him not because they suspected what he was doing, but because they suspected who he was, who notices a plumber, and what happens when the wrong person finally does. In September 1977, Jakob's life as Mehmet started cracking in ways he didn't expect. His girlfriend Aishi left a coded message in their dead drop. She'd been followed twice in 1 week. Not by French intelligence. Someone else. She thought it was Turkish MIT but couldn't confirm. The surveillance stopped after 3 days, which made it worse because whoever was watching had either lost interest or gotten what they needed. Tel Aviv's response came 48 hours later: create distance, make the relationship look like it was cooling naturally. They couldn't risk 2 operatives being compromised at the same time. So, Jakob picked fights with Aishi about money, about her wanting marriage when he wasn't ready, about him working too much, caring too little. The arguments had to feel real because maintaining a fake relationship required the same emotional investment as destroying a real one. He had to hurt someone who didn't exist to protect an identity. That wasn't his. By early 1978, Jakob had placed 14 devices inside the embassy. The operation was working exactly as designed. But something else was happening that no one in Tel Aviv understood. Yet, Jakob was losing track of which thoughts belonged to him and which belonged to Mehmet. He'd started thinking in Turkish first, translating to Hebrew second. He preferred his apartment in the 18th to the Mossad safe house in the 15th. When he filed reports, he had to remind himself which details were surveillance and which were just his day. His handler noticed during a face-to-face meeting in February, asked if Jakob needed rotation out early. Jakob said no. The mission was too important. That was the first lie he told Mossad. The truth was simpler and more frightening. He didn't know how to stop being Mehmet anymore. Then, in March 1978, everything changed. A new diplomat arrived at the Iraqi embassy, Faisal Qasim, cultural attaché on paper, Syrian intelligence liaison, according to Mossad's file. Previously stationed in East Berlin, where he'd caught 2 CIA officers running a secretary in the East German Foreign Ministry. Faisal's first action was ordering a complete security audit, new locks, new badge protocols, new scrutiny on every contracted worker who entered the building. When Mehmet arrived for his routine service call, Faisal was waiting in the lobby. He asked questions Tariq had never thought to ask. Why did Bellinger always send the same plumber? Why not rotate staff for security? Who approved these contracts? Jakob's answer was reasonable. Embassies prefer consistency. Familiar faces reduce risk. Faisal smiled and nodded. But from that day forward, someone watched Mehmet every single moment he was inside the building. For 6 weeks, Jakob couldn't plant anything new. Every visit was monitored, every movement tracked. Tel Aviv told him to wait. Let the attention fade naturally. Don't force it. The attention didn't fade. Faisal implemented a new rule. All contractors had to work in pairs with embassy staff present at all times. Jakob proposed something his handler initially rejected: bring in a second plumber who would draw Faisal's focus while Jakob worked. Make the new person suspicious enough that Mehmet looked safe by comparison. Tel Aviv approved it. In May 1978, a new employee joined Bellinger at Fils, a Kurdish immigrant named Rashid who spoke broken French and seemed nervous around authority. Rashid was Mossad. His assignment was simple: be the threat Faisal was looking for. It worked. When both plumbers arrived, Faisal interrogated Rashid about his background, his politics, whether he had family in Iraq. Rashid stammered, contradicted himself, seemed to hide something. While Faisal focused on Rashid, Mehmet installed 2 new devices in the ambassador's private office, one in an air duct, one behind a radiator valve. The plan was elegant: sacrifice one cover to strengthen another. Make Rashid so obviously suspicious that Mehmet disappeared into the background again. What they didn't know was that Faisal wasn't choosing between them. He suspected both, but he was patient enough to wait and see which one made a mistake first. Then, in August 1978, Rashid vanished. He missed a dead drop. Then another. His apartment was empty when Jacob checked. No forced entry, no sign of struggle, just gone. Mossad's immediate assumption, Syrian or Iraqi intelligence had taken him. They pulled Jacob into a safe house for 3 days while they assessed exposure risk. If Rashid had been compromised and talked, Jacob had hours at most before they came for him too. But nothing happened. The embassy didn't change its security protocols. Tariq greeted Mehmet normally on his next visit. Faisal barely looked at him. After 2 weeks, Tel Aviv made a decision. Rashid had likely been killed, but he hadn't given up the operation before he died. Otherwise, Jacob would already be in a Syrian prison. The mission could continue. That assessment was wrong in every way that mattered. Rashid hadn't been captured. He'd defected to French intelligence. His real name was Omri Tal, and 2 months earlier he'd walked into a DST office and offered them everything: the embassy operation, the device locations, the handler protocols, all of it in exchange for witness protection and relocation to Canada. The reason was simple. He'd been burned on a previous mission in Lebanon, captured and tortured for 16 hours before Mossad extracted him. He couldn't sustain another deep cover, couldn't live as someone else for years. The fear of being Rashid forever had broken something in him he couldn't repair. The French made him an offer he couldn't refuse. "We'll protect you from Mossad, from the Syrians, from everyone. Just tell us what you know." He told them everything, except 2 things he didn't know: that Aishi was Mossad, because Jacob had never mentioned her, and where Jacob actually lived, because Mehmet's apartment was real but Jacob only slept there twice a week. Now, French intelligence faced a choice: expose the operation and damage relations with Israel, a valuable partner, or use the knowledge strategically. They chose strategy. They told the Iraqis nothing. They told the Syrians nothing. Instead, they began feeding Jacob false intelligence through the very devices he'd risked everything to plant. The French assumed Mossad would eventually realize the audio was compromised and pull Jacob out. They assumed wrong. Because Mossad believed Rashid was dead, not that he'd betrayed them willingly. They interpreted his disappearance as proof the operation was still secure. After all, if the French knew, they would have arrested Jacob immediately, wouldn't they? But they didn't arrest him. They did something worse. They let him keep going. In October 1978, Faisal conducted a test. He staged a conversation in the ambassador's office, the room where Jacob had installed 2 devices 3 months earlier. He spoke about a weapons shipment arriving in Marseille, Soviet RPGs being transferred to a Palestinian group, dates, port locations, contact names. Then he waited. If French intelligence acted on it, customs inspections, surveillance at the port, it would confirm a leak. If the Israelis acted, it would confirm Mossad's access. Nothing happened. Faisal concluded there was no penetration. Rashid had probably been a petty criminal fleeing debts. Mehmet was just a plumber who fixed toilets and asked no questions. What Faisal didn't know was that the French had already removed Jacob's devices and replaced them with identical replicas. The audio now routed to DST servers first, then to Mossad handlers second, with carefully timed delays and strategic edits. The Marseille weapons shipment was fiction. The French had removed that entire conversation before forwarding the recording to Tel Aviv. Mossad never heard it, so they never acted on it. Faisal's test confirmed exactly what the French wanted him to believe. Jacob continued his twice-monthly visits through the fall of 1978. He didn't plant new devices. Faisal's scrutiny made it too risky, but he maintained the ones he thought were still active. Checked connections. Replaced batteries when dead drops signaled low power. Every battery he replaced went into a French-controlled microphone. In November, Tel Aviv ordered Jacob to expand coverage to the embassy's secure communications room. The target was a telephone scrambler the Iraqis had just installed for direct calls to Baghdad. If Jacob could place a device inside the scrambler housing, Mossad could intercept calls before encryption. Jacob told his handler it was impossible. The communications room was in the basement, always locked, accessible only to senior staff with magnetic key cards. He'd never been inside, had no legitimate reason to request access. His handler's response: create one. The plan required Jakob to sabotage the embassy's main waterline, a controlled leak that would require emergency access to basement utility connections. Belanger at Fils would receive the emergency call. Mehmet would arrive with his tools and credentials. Jakob spent 2 days arguing against it. Too visible, too much risk. If the sabotage was discovered, every contractor who'd worked in the building would be investigated retroactively. But Tel Aviv insisted. The window was closing. Iraqi intelligence was planning to upgrade the entire communications system in early 1979. This was the last chance. Jakob agreed because he had no real choice. But he requested one modification: let him study the building's plumbing layout for 3 weeks before executing. He needed to identify the exact pipe that would create the right kind of leak serious enough to justify basement access, but not catastrophic enough to trigger a full investigation. His handler approved the delay. For 3 weeks in December 1978, Jacob mapped every water line in the embassy during routine maintenance calls. He traced pipes through walls, identified shutoff valves, calculated pressure points. He wasn't stalling. He was genuinely trying to make the plan work without getting caught. On January 9, 1979, Jacob created the leak. He loosened a compression fitting on a supply line that fed the third-floor bathrooms. Not enough to burst immediately, just enough to weaken over 3 days until water pressure eventually forced it open. The leak started on January 12 at 2:00 p.m. Water flooded through the ceiling into the second-floor hallway. The embassy called Belanger at 2:30. Mehmet arrived at 3:15. Tarek met him at the entrance, visibly stressed. Water was spreading toward the ambassador's office. They needed it stopped immediately. Jacob went to the basement with Tarek and a security guard. The access required 2 keycards Tarek's and the guards used, simultaneously. The door opened into a concrete hallway with the communications room on the left and utility connections on the right. Jacob identified the problem valve within minutes. The repair would take an hour. Tarek and the guard left him alone. They had to manage the water damage upstairs. This was the moment. The communications room was 15 feet away. Jacob had a magnetic keycard duplicator in his toolbox, hidden inside a voltage tester. If he could get inside, even for 30 seconds, he could clone a card for future access. He approached the door, tested the handle. Locked, as expected. Then he heard footsteps in the stairwell. Jakob returned to the valve and started working. The footsteps passed someone heading to the ground floor. But the interruption reminded him he was in a basement corridor with one exit, under an embassy currently flooded with staff dealing with the crisis he'd caused. If someone caught him near that communications room door, there was no explanation. Plumbers don't try locked doors. Plumbers fix pipes and leave. He aborted, finished the valve repair, collected his tools, left. When he reached the lobby, Tarek thanked him, paid him in cash with an apology for the emergency call, said Mehmet was the most reliable contractor they'd ever worked with. Jakob smiled and said it was no trouble, just doing his job. That night, he filed a report admitting he'd failed the objective, couldn't access the communications room, too much risk. Tel Aviv's response surprised him. Well done. The leak itself had value. It confirmed Jakob could create crises without suspicion. They'd find another approach to the scrambler. For the first time in 4 years, Jakob felt something close to relief. He'd tried and failed, but he'd survived. The operation was still intact. What he didn't know was that the French had watched the entire thing. They'd placed a camera in the basement corridor 3 months earlier after Rashid told them about Mossad's interest in the communications room. They watched Jakob approach the door. They watched him abort. They watched him leave. And they realized something that changed their entire assessment. Jakob Lev was more afraid of exposure than he was committed to the mission. He'd chosen survival over objective. That made him predictable. And predictable operatives were useful. The French decided to let the operation continue indefinitely. Not because they wanted Mossad to succeed, because they wanted to control exactly what Mossad believed was succeeding. They began crafting audio feeds specifically designed to confirm Israeli assumptions about Iraqi intentions. Not lies exactly, just truths presented in ways that would lead to predictable Israeli responses. In February 1979, Jacob planted what he believed was his final device, a microphone, in a conference room air vent. The installation took 8 minutes during a radiator inspection. The device transmitted for 6 weeks, before French technicians quietly replaced it with their own. By March 1979, 14 of Jacob's 17 devices were under French control. 3 remained authentic because the DST couldn't access them without revealing their knowledge. Mossad's Paris station considered the operation a complete success. The audio quality was excellent. The intelligence seemed current and actionable. Jacob received a coded message from Tel Aviv. Preparation for extraction would begin in 6 months. He'd served nearly 5 years. Time to come home. He should have felt relief. Instead, he felt something closer to panic. Because Mehmet Yilmaz had a life here, an apartment, friends at the mosque, a history. And Jacob Lev wasn't sure he remembered how to be anyone else. Jacob's extraction was scheduled for September 1979. 6 months to gradually reduce his visits to the embassy, transfer his contracts to other Bellinger employees, let Mehmet fade from view naturally. But in April, something happened that wasn't part of any plan. Aishi, the woman Jacob had been pretending to date for 4 years, told him she was leaving Paris. Not because Mossad was rotating her out, because she'd requested it. She couldn't do this anymore. They met at a cafe in the 11th arrondissement. She ordered coffee in Hebrew without thinking, then caught herself and switched to Turkish. That's when Jacob understood how deep the fracture went. She told him she'd started forgetting which memories were real. She remembered a childhood in Istanbul she'd never lived. She remembered working at the bakery before Mossad recruited her, even though that was impossible. The legend had overwritten her actual past. Jacob said he understood. He did, because the same thing was happening to him. They sat in silence for 10 minutes. Then Aishi asked a question that would stay with Jacob for the rest of his life. When this is over, who do you think you'll be? He had no answer. Mossad pulled Aishi out immediately after that conversation. She returned to Tel Aviv in May 1979 and submitted her resignation 3 weeks later. The agency tried to convince her to stay, reassigned her to analysis work. No more field operations. She refused. Changed her legal name, stopped speaking Turkish entirely, moved to a kibbutz in the north where no one knew what she'd done. The last time Jacob heard about her was in 1983. Someone mentioned she'd married, had a child, worked as a teacher. She never contacted Mossad again, never contacted Jacob. She'd erased Aishi completely, and in doing so, she'd erased parts of herself that could never be recovered. Jacob continued the operation through summer 1979. His final visit to the Iraqi embassy was in August, a routine call to inspect the basement utility connections one last time. Tariq walked him out personally, said he'd miss having such a reliable contractor, said if Mehmet ever needed a recommendation, the embassy would gladly provide one. Jacob thanked him, shook his hand, left. He flew out of Paris on September 3, 1979. Mehmet Yilmaz's apartment lease continued for another 6 months. Mossad maintained it to avoid suspicion. The bank account stayed open. The tax records continued. Mehmet existed on paper for years after Jacob left, and those records became a problem no one anticipated. Jacob returned to Tel Aviv and received a commendation for the operation. 5 years of sustained access to an enemy embassy. 17 devices planted. Hundreds of hours of intelligence gathered. He requested reassignment to technical work. No more field work, no more covers. They agreed. For 2 years, Jacob processed signals intelligence from a desk. He was good at it, efficient. But his supervisors noticed something he never socialized, never formed connections with other analysts. He ate lunch alone, left exactly at the end of his shift. He was keeping himself isolated the same way Mehmet had. The habits of the cover had become his actual personality. In 1982, everything changed. A French DST officer defected to Israel and brought internal files with him. Among them, complete documentation of how French intelligence had compromised the Iraqi embassy operation 18 months before Jacob's extraction. The file included audio transcripts of conversations Jacob had with Aishi, conversations no one else should have known about. Surveillance reports describing Jacob's routines, his habits, the exact times he visited his safe house versus Mehmet's apartment. The French had been watching both of them since September 1977, 2 full years before Rashid's defection. When Jacob read the file, he understood. Rashid hadn't exposed the operation. The operation had already been exposed. Rashid had just confirmed what the French already knew. Everything Jacob had risked for the final 2 years had been theater. The French had let him continue because controlling what Mossad believed was more valuable than stopping what Mossad was doing. The intelligence Jacob gathered after September 1977 wasn't false. It was curated, selected, edited. Real information presented in ways designed to lead Israeli analysts toward specific conclusions. Mossad conducted an internal investigation to determine which decisions had been influenced by the compromised intelligence. The review took 8 months. The findings were classified, but Jacob heard fragments through colleagues. Operations that had been launched based on audio from his devices. Resources allocated. Policies adjusted. All of it shaped by what the French had wanted Israel to believe. The cost wasn't measurable in failed missions. It was measured in years of strategic misdirection that couldn't be undone. Jacob requested the personnel file on Rashid Omri Tal, the man whose defection had revealed the compromise. The file said Tal had relocated to Toronto in 1979 under witness protection, worked as a locksmith, lived quietly. In 1993, Canadian authorities lost contact with him. His apartment was found empty. No forced entry, no indication of where he'd gone. He disappeared the same way he'd disappeared from Paris completely and without explanation. Jacob understood that too. Tal had spent the rest of his life running from an identity he couldn't escape. Maybe he'd built a new one. Maybe he'd just stopped trying to be anyone at all. Mossad stopped using long-term tradesman covers in 1984. Not because they didn't work, because they worked too well. Operatives who lived false identities for 5 years couldn't return to their real ones. The psychological cost was higher than the intelligence value. Jacob Leib still lives in Haifa. He never worked in the field again. When asked about Paris, he says he was never there. And in the most technical sense, he's right. Mehmet Yilmaz was there. But Mehmet Yilmaz never existed. The question Mossad still debates in training seminars: at what point did Jacob stop pretending to be Mehmet and start pretending to be Jacob? No one knows, not even him. If you want to understand how intelligence operations really work, subscribe. The stories we tell aren't about brilliance or heroism. They're about costs no one mentions and consequences no one planned for.